On a warm Georgia evening, the little town of Ashford seemed to hum with the comfort of routine. The courthouse square was quiet, porch lights flickered on one by one, and neighbors waved at each other the way they had for decades. At the center of it all stood Sheriff Harold Gaines, the man people trusted more than anyone else. If you asked anyone in Ashford to name a man of integrity, Harold's name would be the first on their lips. He wasn't just the law. He was the model of what a husband, father, and citizen should be. On Sunday mornings, you'd see him in a neatly pressed suit, walking hand in hand with his wife Linda into First Baptist Church, his two children trailing behind him. He always nodded respectfully to the elderly women in the pews, opened the door for strangers, and volunteered for every community event. When the high school football team needed new uniforms, Harold organized a fundraiser. When a neighbor's house caught fire, Harold was there before the smoke even cleared. People didn't just respect him, they adored him. Linda, his wife of nearly 20 years, wore her pride like a second skin. To her friends, she often said, "I don't just have a husband, I have the best man God ever put on this earth." And she believed it. Harold never missed their daughter's piano recitals, never forgot their son's baseball games. At every school event, there he was broad-shouldered in uniform, smiling proudly, clapping the loudest. To the outside world, they were the American dream, a God-fearing family in a safe little town, anchored by a man who seemed incapable of fault. But Harold's real magic wasn't just in the badge he wore. It was in the way he carried himself. Tall, with streaks of silver already dusting his hair, he had a presence that commanded attention. When he walked into the diner, conversations softened. When he stepped up to the pulpit during town meetings, people leaned in. His voice, calm, firm, steady, had a way of convincing folks that everything would be all right, no matter how bad it seemed. He built this image carefully, brick by brick, over decades. The son of a factory worker, Harold had risen through the ranks not by cutting corners, but by working harder than anyone else. He was known for showing up at crime scenes before his deputies, sometimes still in his Sunday clothes. He was the one who broke up bar fights without drawing his gun, who talked down desperate men standing on bridges. Every story in Ashford painted him as the sheriff who always did the right thing. And yet, for all his visibility, there was a certain mystery about him, too. Harold didn't drink at the bar after hours with the other deputies. He didn't linger long at church socials. After the speeches and the handshakes, he was quick to retreat home, back to his family, back to the quiet brick house on Maple Drive where the lawn was trimmed like clockwork. To most people, that privacy was proof of his devotion to his family. He wasn't the kind of man to chase attention. He was the kind of man who went home. In that small town, children grew up believing Harold Gaines was the standard. Fathers pointed him out to their sons, saying, "Be like the sheriff." Mothers smiled at Linda and whispered, "You're the luckiest woman alive." The Gaines family was the portrait on the mantelpiece of Ashford, untouched, uncracked, gleaming in the eyes of everyone who wanted to believe perfection existed. But perfection is a fragile thing. Behind every polished smile and every handshake, there are shadows no one sees. Behind the steady voice, there are secrets waiting for their moment to erupt. And though the people of Ashford believed they knew their sheriff better than anyone, Harold was a man carrying a truth so heavy it bent every step he took. A truth that, if exposed, would not just unravel his reputation, but shatter the very foundation of his family. For now, though, no one suspected. To the town, Harold Gaines was still the unshakable pillar of honesty and order. He was the man who tucked his kids in at night and kissed his wife on the cheek before bed. He was the man who wore his badge like a crown, his uniform like a second skin. A man who seemed incapable of weakness. And that's the cruel beauty of secrets. They live quietly, in the spaces between praise and pride, biding their time. Ashford slept soundly under the protection of Sheriff Gaines, never realizing that the very man they trusted above all else was standing on a fault line. One crack, one tremor, and everything they believed about him would come crashing down. Mariah Lane didn't belong to Ashford, not in the way Harold Gaines did. She was a transplant, arriving in the town about 5 years back, renting a small one-bedroom apartment above the florist on Main Street. To most locals, she was a mystery. She didn't come from the church crowd, didn't have roots in the county, and she didn't fit into the polite, tight-knit rhythms of the town. But wherever she went, heads turned. Mariah was striking, tall, with long dark hair she wore loose over her shoulders, a face that could hold a smile just long enough to draw you in, then harden into something unreadable. Some whispered she had big city looks, others whispered darker things, but Mariah didn't seem to care. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from surviving storms no one else has seen. What most in Ashford never knew was that Mariah had grown up moving from foster home to foster home, never fully wanted, never fully safe. The quiet apartment above the florist was the first place she had ever been able to decorate for herself, the first place that felt like hers. For her, Harold wasn't just a lover. He was proof that she could finally belong to someone, somewhere. Her past was not something she offered freely, but she didn't hide from it either. Mariah was a trans woman, and while that fact sat quietly in the background for most, in a conservative Georgia town it hung like a shadow. Some avoided her entirely. Others treated her with that false kindness, smiles tight as piano wires. She learned quickly that Ashford was a place where secrets whispered louder than words. It was Harold who first saw her differently. One summer evening, he was called to a disturbance behind a gas station. Some boys in their early 20s, drunk and cruel, had cornered Mariah in the parking lot. They thought they were being funny, tossing out slurs, daring each other to push her harder. By the time Harold pulled up, she was standing her ground, but her hands were trembling. Harold stepped between them, his voice cold steel. "Go home," he told the boys, and they scattered like dogs whipped for misbehaving. For a moment, it was just the two of them, Mariah with her guarded eyes, Harold with his steady calm. She said thank you, her voice soft, and Harold found himself lingering longer than a sheriff should. That night should have ended like any other call. He should have driven back to his house, poured himself a coffee, and forgotten about the woman who almost got jumped at the gas station. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself circling back to that image of her, unflinching yet vulnerable, proud yet trembling. Something in her stirred a piece of him he thought he'd buried years ago. The second time he saw her was not on duty. He stopped by the diner one late afternoon and found her sitting alone in a booth, sipping coffee, eyes lost out the window. Against his better judgment, he slid into the seat across from her. Their conversation was small at first. How long she'd been in town, how she liked the quiet, how she never really felt like she fit anywhere. Harold listened, and in her voice he heard something he never admitted to himself: loneliness. From there, it was like gravity pulling them closer. He'd stopped by her apartment under the pretense of checking in, making sure she was safe, reminding himself it was part of his duty. Soon, the pretense disappeared. He started showing up late at night, long after his family was asleep, sitting with her in that small apartment where the smell of lavender candles clung to everything. Their conversations stretched until dawn, from light banter to confessions neither had shared with anyone else. It was Mariah who gave Harold something his perfect life never did: the freedom to be imperfect. With her, he didn't have to be the sheriff, the husband, the father, the man everyone believed him to be. He could drop the mask, let his voice crack, admit he was tired of living up to the image. She didn't judge. She simply looked at him with eyes that seemed to say, "I see you, the real you." But what Harold never fully grasped was that for Mariah, this wasn't just an affair. It was hope. She had spent her whole life being pushed to the edges, made to feel like she was too much or not enough. With Harold, she thought she'd finally found something solid, something that proved she was worthy of love, even in a town that wanted to pretend she didn't exist. She wanted more than stolen nights and whispered promises. She wanted acknowledgement. At first, Harold played along. He bought her small gifts, books she mentioned, a necklace she admired in a store window. He told her she was beautiful, told her she mattered. He told her he cared. But even as he said the words, a part of him recoiled, terrified of what it would mean if anyone else found out. To Mariah, those words were a lifeline. To Harold, they were a dangerous indulgence. As months turned into years, the relationship took on its own rhythm. Harold kept the world at bay by day and crept into Mariah's world by night. He convinced himself he could live two lives forever, balancing the perfect family and the hidden lover. He was careful, too careful. No text that could be traced, no calls that could be overheard. Everything was face-to-face, in secret. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Mariah began to feel the weight of his fear, the way he flinched whenever she mentioned being seen together in public, the way he recoiled when she asked about his wife. To her, it felt like rejection, a reminder that she was good enough for his passion, but not his truth. To Harold, it was survival. And so the tension grew, silently at first, like a hairline crack in glass. Harold still kissed his wife goodnight, still bowed his head at church, still shook hands in town hall. But every time he looked at Mariah, every time she touched his hand and whispered that she deserved more, the crack widened. He wanted to believe he could keep everything in balance, but deep down, both of them knew balance doesn't last. Sooner or later, something gives. By day, Sheriff Harold Gaines was the man everyone counted on. He wore his uniform like a second skin, crisp and pressed, his badge shining beneath the Georgia sun. The townspeople saw him driving his cruiser down Main Street, waving politely, chatting with store owners, lifting groceries for elderly neighbors. To anyone watching, he was the picture of stability. He carried himself like a man with nothing to hide. But when the sun set and the porch lights flicked on across Ashford, Harold became someone else entirely. He learned how to invent excuses, how to create alibis out of thin air. Late paperwork at the office, he'd tell Linda as he kissed her on the cheek. Meeting with the county board, he'd say, grabbing his keys. Sometimes it was a call from state troopers or an early patrol shift. She rarely questioned him. Why would she? He'd never given her reason to doubt. For nearly 20 years, Harold had been the rock of her world. Yet while Linda settled in with a glass of wine and their kids finished homework at the kitchen table, Harold's car rolled quietly across town. He would park 2 blocks away from Mariah's building, careful never to pull up right in front. He slipped into the back staircase, taking the narrow steps 2 at a time, his heart pounding not from fear, but from anticipation. By the time he knocked softly on her door, his breathing was shallow, his mask already slipping. Inside that tiny apartment, Harold was no longer the sheriff. He was just a man, flawed, weak, desperate for the one place where he didn't have to pretend. He and Mariah talked for hours, about everything and nothing. She would tease him about the gray at his temples, smooth his calloused hands, and whisper things that cut through his polished facade. She knew his secrets, his insecurities, his doubts about whether he was truly living the life he wanted. And Harold let her see them, because with her, he didn't need the armor. But the double life carried a cost. The lies piled up, heavier each week. Harold found himself staring at his family at the dinner table, wondering if Linda noticed the way his eyes wandered, if his children could sense something was wrong. Once, during a church sermon about fidelity and honesty, his throat closed up so tight he could barely breathe. Sitting in the front pew, Harold felt the words like knives. Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. He wanted to walk out, but he stayed, plastering on the same stoic smile he always wore. At first, Linda dismissed the changes as stress. Harold had always taken his role too seriously, she thought, always carried the weight of Ashford on his shoulders. But little cracks began to show. He came home smelling faintly of lavender, Mariah's favorite candle. He grew more distracted, his mind elsewhere when Linda spoke. And when she reached for him at night, more often than not, he rolled away. Mariah, on the other hand, was no longer content with stolen moments. At first, she told herself it was enough. After all, she had Harold's attention, his affection, the kind of intimacy she'd longed for her whole life. But months turned into years, and still he kept her in the shadows. Every time she asked to go out in public, he dodged. Every time she mentioned meeting his family, he shut down. What had once felt romantic, this secret they guarded together, now felt like a cage. For Harold, the pressure was unbearable. He lived in constant fear of discovery. He triple-checked his phone, erased every trace, never let Mariah's number show. He panicked at the thought of someone spotting his cruiser parked too close to her building. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to resist, he couldn't stay away. His need for her pulled him back, again and again, even as the lies choked him. There were close calls. One evening, Harold's daughter came downstairs late at night and found him sneaking out. He muttered something about an urgent call, but her suspicious glance lingered. Another time, Linda washed his shirt and pulled a long strand of dark hair from the collar. Harold laughed it off, said it was from shaking hands at a fundraiser, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Still, no one wanted to believe the sheriff could be guilty of betrayal. His image was too polished, his record too spotless. And Harold leaned on that image like a shield, telling himself he could keep this balance forever. A perfect family on one side, forbidden love on the other. Two worlds never meant to touch. But the problem with living two lives is that eventually one will crash into the other. Mariah was growing restless. Harold was growing reckless. And the walls between them were growing thinner every day. Mariah Lane had been patient for as long as she could. For years, she accepted the stolen hours, the whispered promises, the quiet moments when Harold Gaines shed his armor and held her like he never held anyone else. But patience eventually turns sour, and love without acknowledgement begins to feel like a lie. She wanted more. She wanted him not as a secret, not as a shadow tucked away in her apartment, but as a man who would stand beside her in the daylight. At first, her requests were gentle. "Harold," she whispered one night, tracing the lines of his face with her fingers, "I can't keep hiding like this. Don't you want more than this, more than sneaking around?" He brushed her off with a practiced smile, kissing her forehead. "You know I can't. People wouldn't understand. It's complicated." But Mariah wasn't satisfied with excuses anymore. Each time she asked, his answers grew shorter, colder. The fight started small, but they quickly escalated. Mariah accused him of using her, of treating her like a dirty secret while basking in his perfect family image. Harold defended himself, insisting he loved her, that he just couldn't risk losing everything. "You knew what this was," he said one night, his jaw clenched tight. "I can't throw away my marriage, my career, my whole life." Her response was sharp, filled with a bitterness she couldn't hold back. "Then what am I, Harold? A distraction? A toy you put back in a box when you're done? I deserve better than this, and you know it." For Harold, every word cut deep. He did love her in his own conflicted way, but he was terrified of what that love meant. In the small, rigid world of Ashford, being exposed would destroy him. It wasn't just about losing his badge. It was about losing the respect, the reverence, the identity he had built for decades. And worse, losing his family. The thought of Linda discovering the truth haunted him at night. But Mariah was no longer willing to play by his rules. She began dropping hints, veiled threats laced into her words. Maybe Linda deserves to know what her husband does after dark. Maybe the people of this town should see who you really are. Harold's blood ran cold every time she said it. His life balanced on the edge of a knife, and she was twisting it. He tried to placate her, bringing gifts, whispering apologies, swearing he'd find a way. But every attempt only made things worse. To Mariah, his gifts felt like hush money. To Harold, her defiance felt like blackmail. Their once secret romance had transformed into a battlefield, each encounter loaded with tension. The cracks began to show outside their little cocoon. Harold snapped at his deputies over minor mistakes, his patience wearing thin. He came home distracted, irritable, retreating into silence at the dinner table. Linda noticed. The children noticed. The perfect image he had built was starting to crumble at the edges, and Harold felt it slipping from his grasp. Then came the night Mariah pushed harder than ever before. She showed up at one of his patrol stops, slipping into the shadows until he was alone. "You can't ignore me forever," she hissed, her eyes blazing. "I'm not going to be your secret anymore. Either you tell the truth, or I will." For the first time, Harold lost his composure with her. He grabbed her wrist, too hard, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare. You don't know what you're playing with, Mariah. You'll ruin everything." She pulled away, holding his gaze with defiance. Maybe it's not me ruining it. Maybe it's you, too afraid to live the life you want. That night, Harold lay awake in bed beside Linda, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in his body rigid. His wife's steady breathing beside him, the faint sound of his children in their rooms. Everything he stood to lose screamed louder than Mariah's threats. He told himself she was bluffing. He told himself she wouldn't go through with it. But in his heart, he knew she was serious. Mariah had reached her limit, and Harold had reached his breaking point. In the following days, their exchanges grew more volatile. He avoided her calls, hoping distance would cool her fury, but it only inflamed her more. She began showing up unannounced, appearing outside his office, waiting in the parking lot near his cruiser. Each time, Harold's heart raced with panic. What if someone saw? What if she confronted him in public? By now, it wasn't just fear, it was desperation. Harold felt cornered, trapped in a maze with no way out. To confess meant losing everything. To continue meant risking exposure at any moment. And to silence her, well, that thought began to creep in, unwelcome but persistent, like a whisper he couldn't shake. The love that once gave Harold freedom had become a noose tightening around his neck. Mariah's pleas had become demands. Her demands had become threats. And Harold, the sheriff who spent his life upholding the law, found himself contemplating the unthinkable. Neither of them knew it yet, but the collision was inevitable. Two lives, two truths, hurtling toward a night that would leave blood on the floor and shatter the illusion of Ashford's perfect sheriff forever. The night it all came crashing down began like any other in the Gaines household. The kitchen smelled of baked chicken and cornbread, the table set neatly by Linda, and the children bickered playfully over who would get the last roll. Harold sat at the head of the table, his badge and sidearm resting on the counter just a few feet away. To anyone looking in through the window, it was the portrait of American family life. A sheriff, his wife, and two children sharing a quiet dinner in their small Georgia town. But beneath the easy chatter, Harold's mind was elsewhere. Mariah's voice still echoed from their last argument. Tell them the truth, or I will. The threat replayed over and over, each repetition tightening the knot in his chest. He forced himself to laugh at his son's joke, to nod along with Linda's stories about church, but the weight of dread pressed down on him. He knew it was only a matter of time before the balance shattered. And then came the knock. It wasn't polite, wasn't hesitant. It was sharp, urgent, 3 hard raps against the front door that silenced the table mid-conversation. Harold's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Linda frowned, rising to her feet, but Harold was already pushing back his chair. Something in the pit of his stomach told him exactly who it was. When he opened the door, the night air rushed in, cool and heavy. And there she stood, Mariah Lane, in a fitted red blouse and jeans, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes locked on his with a fire that dared him to look away. Harold, she said, her voice clear enough for the family behind him to hear. We need to talk. Now. Linda appeared at his shoulder, confusion painted across her face. Who is this? She asked. The children had crept closer, their wide eyes darting between the stranger and their father. Mariah didn't hesitate. She took a step forward, her voice rising. Tell them who I am, Harold. Tell them the truth about us, about what you've been doing all these years. The color drained from Harold's face. His perfect world, the image he had spent decades crafting, was collapsing right there on his doorstep in the gaze of his wife and children. He tried to speak, but his throat felt strangled. Linda's eyes narrowed, her lips parting as realization clawed its way in. Harold, what is she talking about? Mariah's voice grew sharper, louder. Don't lie, Harold. Not anymore. You love me. You've told me that 1,000 times. They deserve to know who their father really is. The children stared at him, horror and confusion twisting across their faces. Linda's hands trembled at her sides. And in that moment, Harold felt something inside him snap. Not here, he hissed, grabbing Mariah's arm with a force that made her wince. Not in front of them. Why not? She shot back, jerking against his grip. You're so afraid of the truth? You think you can keep living a lie? He dragged her through the hallway toward the garage, his family following in stunned silence. Linda called after him, "Harold, stop. What are you doing?" But he ignored her. He pulled Mariah into the dimly lit garage, the smell of motor oil and concrete swallowing them both. "Please," Harold begged in a harsh whisper, slamming the door shut behind them. "Don't do this. Not like this. You don't know what you're doing." Mariah's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm tired of being your secret. If you won't admit it, then I will." He paced like a trapped animal, running his hands over his head, the veins in his neck bulging. Panic coursed through him, hotter than any anger he'd ever known. He could hear Linda's muffled voice through the door, could sense his children's presence just beyond the threshold. The image of their faces, filled with shock and betrayal, seared itself into his mind. His eyes flicked once more toward the thin line of light under the garage door, where he knew his wife and children were watching, frozen in horror. Years of secrets, lies, and fear piled into that one moment, pressing on him like the walls were closing in. It wasn't just Mariah's threats. It was the unbearable weight of their eyes, seeing the man he truly was. And in that split second, Harold felt something inside him break for good. And then, almost without thinking, his hand reached for the weapon he'd left on the counter earlier. In his head, 1,000 voices screamed, "Don't stop, think," but another voice, darker and louder, drowned them out. "It's the only way. You can't let her ruin you." Mariah saw the motion, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Harold, no, you wouldn't." His hand shook violently as he leveled the gun at her chest. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I can't lose everything. I can't." The garage door creaked open just an inch, and Linda's horrified face appeared in the gap. "Harold, please. Don't do this." The children's cries rang behind her, high and terrified. Mariah took a step forward, her palms out, her voice trembling now. "You don't have to choose like this. You love me, Harold. You said I mattered. Look at me. If you do this, you'll destroy everything anyway." But Harold was past reason. The walls were closing in, the life he'd built disintegrating before his eyes. He couldn't hear Mariah's words anymore. All he could hear was the pounding of his heart and the echo of that one thought. It ends here. The shot exploded in the confined space, deafening, final. Mariah staggered backward, shock etched across her face as blood bloomed through her blouse. She collapsed onto the cold concrete, her body curling against itself, the light in her eyes fading as her last breath escaped. For a moment, the world went silent. Then came the screams. Linda burst into the garage, her children clinging to her, their sobs piercing the heavy air. She stared at her husband, standing over the body of the woman he'd killed, his gun still trembling in his hands. The sheriff, the man she thought she knew, looked like a stranger. The badge on the counter no longer shone with honor. It lay dull, tarnished by the blood soaking into the concrete below. And as Harold's wife and children wept in the doorway, the sheriff of Ashford realized that the secret he had killed to protect was the very thing that had just destroyed him. The morning after the gunshot echoed through Harold Gaines's garage, Ashford was no longer the same sleepy Georgia town it had been the day before. Word traveled faster than the sheriff's deputies could even write the first report. By sunrise, people were whispering in the diner, in the pews at church, in line at the gas station. The sheriff killed someone. Not just someone, a woman, his lover. The headline on the Ashford Gazette hit like a hammer. Sheriff Gaines accused of shooting mistress in family home. The words felt impossible to the townspeople who had built Harold up as their model of integrity. Mothers who had told their sons to be like the sheriff shook their heads in disbelief. Fathers who had admired his composure cursed his name. Overnight, Harold went from hero to pariah. Neighbors gathered in tight clusters on their porches, debating the unthinkable. "There's no way it's true," some insisted. "Not Harold. Not the man who baptized his kids right in that church." Others weren't so forgiving. "I knew there was something off," one woman said, clutching her Bible. "No man is that perfect. He was hiding something." The shock wasn't just about the murder. It was about who the victim was. When the town learned Mariah Lane was a trans woman, the scandal exploded into something even bigger. Some reacted with cruel mockery, sneering that Harold had been living a double life. Others found it tragic, proof of the suffocating secrets that small towns bred. Whatever the opinion, everyone agreed. Ashford would never look at Harold Gaines the same way again. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their microphones flashing, their cameras pointed at the station that once stood as a symbol of trust. National outlets picked up the story. A sheriff's secret, one network called it. The double life of Harold Gaines, said another. Suddenly, Ashford, a place where news usually meant a new pie flavor at Betty Lou's Diner, was on every TV in America. For Linda Gaines, the fallout was unbearable. She couldn't go to the grocery store without whispers following her down the aisle. At church, people either hugged her with pity or avoided her entirely, unsure if they should comfort or condemn. Her children suffered the worst. At school, classmates snicker behind their backs, cruel rumors spreading faster than the truth. Teachers tried to protect them, but the shame clung like smoke. Inside the Gaines home, silence reigned. The laughter that once filled the halls was gone. The framed family photos on the wall seemed to mock Linda now, reminders of the life she thought she had. She replayed that night over and over. The knock at the door, the stranger's voice, the deafening gunshot. She had married a man she thought was built of honor, and instead she had watched him unravel into a killer. Meanwhile, Mariah Lane's name became a flashpoint. For some in the LGBTQ+ community across Georgia, she became a symbol of resilience cut short. Her death a tragic example of how secrecy and shame could end in blood. Candlelight vigils were held outside her apartment building. Friends painted her as a woman full of life, someone who deserved more than to be remembered only as the sheriff's secret. But in Ashford, not everyone was ready to honor her memory. The whispers were laced with judgment. Some muttered that she had brought it on herself by tempting a married man. Others spat uglier words, using her gender identity as a weapon even in death. The town was divided, not just over Harold's guilt, but over what Mariah's existence meant in their narrow world. The sheriff's office scrambled to pick up the pieces. Deputies who had once idolized Harold now worked under a cloud of suspicion. How could they uphold the law when their leader had broken it in the worst way? Some resigned, unable to stomach the disgrace. Others stayed, but their eyes were haunted. The badge no longer carried pride, it carried shame. In the courthouse, people packed the gallery at every pretrial hearing, desperate for answers. They leaned forward as prosecutors laid out the timeline. The affair, the threats, the confrontation at the Gaines home. Each revelation was like gasoline poured onto an already raging fire. Ashford's people weren't just spectators. They were witnesses to the disintegration of the very man they had once trusted to protect them. The broader world seized on the scandal. Pundits on television debated what it meant. A sheriff killing to protect his reputation, a small town grappling with secrets, a transgender woman silenced by violence. Some called Harold a hypocrite, a coward hiding behind the law. Others painted him as a man trapped by circumstance, driven to desperation by fear of exposure. Either way, the story became more than a local tragedy. It became a mirror held up to America's deepest contradictions: faith, family, secrecy, and shame. In the middle of it all, Harold sat in a jail cell, stripped of his uniform, stripped of his dignity. He had spent years building himself into the image of an untouchable man, and now the bars around him told a different story. Reporters begged for interviews, but Harold said nothing. To the world outside, his silence was guilt. To Linda and the children, it was betrayal. Ashford would never be the same. The town that once prided itself on unity now whispered with suspicion and division. Some swore they would never trust a man in uniform again. Others prayed louder, desperate to believe that God could cleanse even this. But no prayer, no headline, no whispered justification could change the truth. The sheriff, the man they had placed on a pedestal, had pulled the trigger. And the blood on his garage floor stained not only his name, but the entire town that had worshipped him. The courthouse in Ashford had never seen anything like it. Reporters lined the steps before dawn, their vans crowding the square, satellite dishes jutting into the sky. Locals gathered too, pressing against barricades, some clutching signs demanding justice for Mariah Lane, others holding handwritten notes of support for Harold Gaines. The trial wasn't just about one man anymore. It had become a stage where the whole town's soul was on display. Inside, the gallery buzzed with restless energy. Every seat was filled, and the overflow room played the proceedings on a screen. The Gaines children weren't present, shielded from the storm, but Linda was there. She sat stiffly in the second row, her face pale, her wedding ring gone. She hadn't spoken publicly since the night of the shooting, but her very presence sent ripples through the room. When Harold was led in, shackled and wearing a plain gray suit instead of a sheriff's uniform, gasps swept through the gallery. The man who once commanded a room with quiet authority now looked diminished, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He tried to scan the crowd, but when his gaze flickered toward Linda, she turned away, her jaw clenched tight. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as a man who had let his secrets curdle into violence. They laid out the timeline piece by piece. The years-long affair with Mariah Lane, the arguments that escalated into threats, the knock at the Gaines' home on that fateful night. They read Mariah's text aloud in court. "You can't keep me hidden forever. Either you tell the truth, or I will." The words hung heavy in the courtroom, echoes of a voice no longer there to defend herself. To strengthen their case, the prosecutors called neighbors who had heard shouting from the garage before the gunshot. They introduced evidence from the crime scene, the angle of the wound, the proximity of the shot. Expert witnesses testified that Harold had fired at point-blank range. It wasn't self-defense, they argued. It was execution. Then came the testimony everyone dreaded, Linda Gaines. When she walked to the stand, the room held its breath. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she described the dinner that night. The knock at the door, Mariah's demand for the truth, and the deafening sound of the gunshot. "Did you see your husband pull the trigger?" the prosecutor asked. Linda's lips quivered. "Yes," she whispered. "I saw him kill her. Right there, in front of our children." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. For years, the town had looked at the Gaines marriage as unshakable, a pillar of decency. Now, Linda's testimony dismantled it, exposing not just Harold's crime, but the fragile illusions they all had believed. The defense tried to counter, arguing that Harold had been pushed to the edge, that Mariah's threats were emotional blackmail, that he acted in panic rather than premeditation. They painted him as a man trapped by fear, trying desperately to protect his family and reputation. He was cornered, Harold attorney said. He didn't see a way out. But the prosecution hammered back, reminding the jury that Harold wasn't just any man. He was the sheriff, sworn to uphold the law, trained to handle crisis without violence. If anyone should have known how to walk away, the prosecutor thundered, pointing straight at him, it was Harold Gaines. And instead, he chose murder. When Harold himself took the stand, the room went silent. He spoke softly, his voice frayed, but still carried the cadence that once reassured his town. He admitted to the affair, admitted to the confrontation, but insisted he never meant to kill Mariah. "She pushed me," he said, tears brimming. "Not physically, but she pushed me into a place I didn't know how to escape. I loved her, but I love my family too. I lost control." For a moment, some in the gallery pitied him. They saw not the sheriff, but a man unraveling under the weight of his own lies. But others shook their heads, unmoved. Losing control didn't excuse pulling a trigger. The final blow came when the prosecution replayed the 911 call Linda had made seconds after the shooting. The recording filled the courtroom with chaos. Linda's frantic screams, the children crying in the background, her voice breaking as she told the operator, "My husband shot her. He shot his lover in our garage." By the time closing arguments arrived, the air in the courthouse was electric. The prosecution framed the case as a betrayal of trust, a man who wore the badge of law but used violence to silence his truth. The defense pleaded for understanding, urging the jury to see Harold as human, flawed, desperate. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they filed back in, eyes heavy but certain, the room leaned forward as the foreman read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Harold Gaines, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps and murmurs swept through the gallery. Linda closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her face. Harold's head fell into his hands as the weight of the words crushed him. The sheriff who had once been the pride of Ashford would now die behind bars. But beyond the verdict, something deeper had been revealed. The trial wasn't just about Harold's guilt. It was about the fragility of the masked people wear, the lies they tell to protect themselves, and the devastating price when those lies collapse. As the judge banged the gavel, sealing Harold's fate, the townspeople filed out into the hot Georgia afternoon. Some left in silence, others whispering, but all of them knew one truth. Ashford would never again be the town it had been before the sheriff's secrets spilled into the light. The sentence was delivered with the heavy finality of a church bell. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sheriff who once walked into Ashford's diner with a nod of respect now shuffled out of the courthouse in shackles, his eyes downcast, the weight of his badge forever stripped away. For Harold Gaines, there was no redemption, no carefully constructed image left to cling to. He had gone from the town's most trusted man to its most infamous killer. In the weeks after the trial, Ashford tried to settle back into its routines, but nothing felt the same. The courthouse square still bustled, church bells still rang on Sundays, and kids still played baseball in the summer heat. Yet a shadow lingered, a reminder that even the man they thought was untouchable had been hiding a secret darker than anyone dared imagine. People spoke his name in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if the very mention might summon the memory of that gunshot. For Linda Gaines, the aftermath was something no verdict could mend. She filed for divorce immediately, changing her last name back to her maiden one. The family house on Maple Drive was sold quietly, stripped of the photographs and mementos that once declared them the perfect family. She and the children relocated to another county, hoping anonymity would soften the stares and the whispers. But the scars followed them. Her children carried questions they couldn't put into words. How could their father choose a bullet over the truth? How could the man who tucked them in at night destroy their lives with one pull of a trigger? At night, Linda sometimes woke to the sound of her son crying into his pillow, begging for answers she could never give. Her daughter stopped playing piano altogether, the music silenced by shame. And Linda herself, though she filed for divorce, often caught her hands trembling when she remembered the way Harold used to smile across the dinner table, as if she couldn't reconcile the man she loved with the killer in the garage. Mariah Lane's story didn't end in the garage that night. Across Georgia, vigils were held in her name, candles flickering against the dark, her friends and allies speaking out against the silence and shame that had cost her life. To the LGBTQ+ community, she became more than just a victim. She became a symbol of the dangerous cost of secrecy, of how hidden love and societal judgment could twist into tragedy. Her picture, laughing, radiant, was carried on posters at rallies, her name invoked as a call for justice. Still, in Ashford, her memory was complicated. Some townsfolk whispered cruelly, blaming her for pushing too hard, for threatening the sheriff's reputation. Others condemned Harold more fiercely, insisting that no matter the circumstance, he had no right to take her life. The divide cut through pews at church, through conversations at the diner, through friendships that had lasted decades. What was once a town united in faith and tradition now felt fractured, each side unwilling to see the other's truth. In his cell, Harold shrank from the man he once was. Gone was the polished uniform, the authoritative stride. Now he moved quietly, a ghost of himself, his silver hair growing wild, his eyes heavy with sleepless nights. Fellow inmates recognized him, the sheriff who killed his lover, and some mocked him openly, stripping him of whatever dignity he clung to. Others kept their distance, as if his disgrace were contagious. Alone at night, Harold would stare at the ceiling, hearing again the echo of the shot, seeing Mariah's face as she fell, and the horror etched into the faces of his wife and children. He had killed to protect his secret, but the irony was merciless. By pulling that trigger, he ensured the whole world would know the truth. Years later, the story of Sheriff Gaines still haunted Ashford. The garage on Maple Drive, where Mariah had taken her last breath, became a point of morbid fascination. New owners tried to scrub it clean, repainting walls, replacing floors, but neighbors swore the place still carried an unease, as though the walls themselves remembered. At the diner, old-timers shook their heads whenever the name came up, muttering about the days before the sheriff fell. And for those who had once idolized Harold, the betrayal cut deepest. He hadn't just failed as a man, he had failed as a symbol. He was proof that even the people you trusted most could be living a double life, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from the man you thought you knew best. Mariah's grave, marked with a simple headstone, often bore fresh flowers. Strangers visited, leaving notes, "You deserve better. Rest in truth." For her friends, her legacy became one of courage, the woman who demanded love in the light, even if it cost her everything. And so the tale of Sheriff Harold Gaines remained, not as a cautionary fable tucked into small-town memory, but as a wound that reminded everyone who heard it of one simple, devastating truth: secrets have a way of coming out. And when they do, they don't just expose lies, they destroy lives. In the end, the sheriff's story was not about law and order, nor about honor and respect. It was about the fragility of the masks we wear, the lengths we'll go to protect them, and the carnage left behind when they finally shatter. Ashford never forgot the night its sheriff pulled the trigger. And America, watching from afar, never forgot the price Mariah Lane paid for daring to be loved in the light.